Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today as, of course, we celebrate Africa Day and also look into something that is really not worth celebrating, but raises great concern on this fantastic day where we commemorate the formation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963 in Addis Ababa, which saw the establishment of this day that we describe as Africa Day. Now, for this webinar that you are joining, we'll be looking at trying to unpack the role of illicit financial flows in Zimbabwe's political economy. And certainly, as you would be aware, the political economy of Zimbabwe has been characterized at times by this very worrying aspect of it, which talks about the predatory nature of some of the political elites, particularly in the governing ZANU-PF, and certainly how they engage in this process of eliciting these financial flows from Zimbabwe's very challenged political economy. In actual fact, maybe we can bring you into confidence and give you a sense of what we've been doing at Good Governance Africa over maybe the past year, which has really been characterized by a series of open and closed discussions that focus on key aspects of Zimbabwe's politics, society, and also economy. And we've carried out these webinars, closed and open, really as an attempt to try and generate some kind of discourse focused on creating positive change in Zimbabwe. We've also done this as part of a way to ensure that we create a network-centric group of stakeholders, both in Zimbabwe, across the region, and beyond, who are focused on advocating for these necessary policy changes. It's important for us to note at this stage that Good Governance Africa is an applied policy research think tank that is focused on advocating for positive governance in Africa, and certainly in the various large multinationals and corporates who operate across our wonderful continent. Now, to bring us back to the focus of today's seminar, and to do so, I think I have to go back a bit and let you know about some of the work and seminars and some of the discussions that have come out in previous engagements. We began these series of seminars by really focusing on the constitutional order and the rule of law in Zimbabwe. We then looked at the need for security sector reform in that country. We also addressed the challenges that are faced by the very narrow and closed media landscape in Zimbabwe. And of course, we then joined in at a very early stage on that campaign known as Zimbabwe Lives Matter as a platform to bring about some kind of reform in that country. However, as we noted in the concept note that we shared in preparation for this focus on illicit financial flows from Zimbabwe, that much work has been done by various of our colleagues into the nature and the extent of these financial flows. One of them that was been most prominent has been the report on cartel power dynamics in Zimbabwe, which was done by our colleagues from the Daily Maverick, led by Mark Haywood. And maybe we can bring him to the fore so you can get a look at him. Mark Haywood has kindly agreed to come and join us in these discussions to give us a sense of what their report unpacked with regards to these illicit financial flows, but more importantly, to give us a sense of the crucial role that these cartels play in the rent-seeking tendencies that we note. Similarly, the Africa Risk Consulting Report was one of the other pieces of work that we have referenced in the studies that we have undertaken that focus on these illicit financial flows. And to give us a sense really of how these illicit financial flows are carried out by the government, we've invited the former Finance Minister of Zimbabwe, Honorable Tendai Biti, to join us on the panel today. As you would be aware, Honorable Biti has extensive knowledge and activism credentials stemming back from his time as one of the leaders of the opposition in Zimbabwe. And he'll be joining us today to give us a sense about that. We're also joined by Farai Magu, who is the founding director for the Center of Resource Governance, because one of the things that emerged from the Cartel's report and also from this Africa Risk Consulting report is the crucial importance of access to resources. And we're talking about mineral resources in Zimbabwe as a way to finance and plug into these illicit financial flows, these IFFs that form the opaque financial dealings that stem from tax avoidance, illegal commercial activities, but very much linked to the resources sector. We'll also be joined by Professor Francis Gudyanga, who is the author of Minerals in Africa, Opportunities for the Continent's Industrialization, who will give us a sense about what his work and his studies have sort of shed light on with regards to these illicit financial flows. And then last but not least, acting as discussant is my very capable colleague, Siku Mashingaidze, who is a lead researcher at Good Governance Africa, who will give us a sense of the extent and how our discussions will have brought us to hopefully some very logical conclusions in the end. So without further ado, let me invite my colleague, Mark Haywood, to come in here and give us a sense about what his report on cartel power dynamics in Zimbabwe has really indicated to us, in particular with regards to the manner and the extent to which these networks of cartels in Zimbabwe permeate both regional and international networks. By way of introduction, for 15 minutes, please, Mark, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much for organizing this afternoon's important webinar. You know, I think the first thing I have to say is to demystify this very concept of illicit financial flows that your introduction has so articulately drawn our attention to, and make it clear that when we're talking about illicit financial flows, we are talking about corruption, financial corruption, unlawful behavior that is unlawful at a national level and at an international level. And it is corruption that, like all corruption, is not a victimless crime. The people who pay the price of elite corruption are always poor people, ordinary people. And it is the ordinary people of Zimbabwe in this instance who pay for the illicit financial flows that are conducted, facilitated by the elite of that country, very often in collaboration with elites of other Southern African countries and other developed countries. And so we have to understand this, I think, first and foremost, as a human rights violation. You know, you were asking what is the cost in Zimbabwe. Well, let me give you a striking illustration of it. The Africa Risk Consulting report that you referred to in your introduction estimates the personal wealth of the president of Zimbabwe, Emerson Mnangagwa, at $500 million US. And yet the per capita income of a Zimbabwean, when I checked it a few minutes ago, was somewhere in the region of 900 or 1,000 US dollars. Zimbabwe is a rich country, as the panelists know better than me, in resources, but it is a poor country in terms of what it has been subjected to in terms of very sophisticated and sustained corruption, much of which involves the hiding of money and the subject of today, illicit financial flows. So thank you for this opportunity to talk to this report and for the opportunity to be alongside people like the Honorable Tendai Biti, who I think from his practical experience as an MP, as the former chair of the Public Accounts Committee in the Zimbabwean Parliament, knows very, very, very much more than I do about this subject. And I should also say, Chris, to you and your viewers at the outset, that I'm not the author of this report. I'm the editor of this report and the publisher of this report. It's called Cartel Dynamics in Zimbabwe, and we published it in February of this year. But it had to be, the report was written and researched in Zimbabwe, but it had to be published outside of Zimbabwe, and it had to be published anonymously because the authors of the report, academics and activists, were fearful that publishing this report would bring upon them the wrath of the Zimbabwean state. And I think that the very fact that the report's authors had to publish it anonymously tells us something, that this is not an academic issue, that it's difficult to tackle illicit financial flows. It's difficult to tackle any type of corruption in a climate where the regime that you are criticizing is unpredictable and unstable and prone to lashing out at its critics, imprisoning, torturing, and sometimes even murdering those critics. And it was for those reasons that, when I was asked, would we publish this, I agreed that we would publish it. I undertook as the editor to ensure that it was thoroughly, methodically fact-checked. It's a report that has 462 different references. I had to ascertain the integrity of the report, and I believe that the report is accurate and honest and a very frank description of Zimbabwe's cartel economy as it exists today. But I would also say to the listeners, as you again hinted, Chris, at the outset, that although the focus of this report is Zimbabwe, it has implications for South Africa and internationally. And when I was working on this report, what I realized was that whilst Zimbabwe perhaps represents a very developed, advanced, sophisticated form of capture of the state by political and economic elites and repurposing of that state for private interests, it is by no means unique in Southern Africa, or indeed in Africa at all. But if you look at what is happening in Mozambique, if you look at what is happening in Angola, if you look at the current attempts taking place in Zambia to de-democratize that country, and if you look at what's happening in my country, South Africa, you see that this is a problem across the region. And what you will also see is that there is often quite a lot of overlap and cooperation between these criminal, political, and economic elites. And really, if you want a chilling vision of what the end game, what the end result of allowing illicit financial flows on a grand scale to continue unchecked, you really just need to look to northern Mozambique at the moment, Cabo Delgado, a province that has been starved of resources, and that as a result of its starvation has been plunged into a social conflict, a military conflict, and a vast humanitarian crisis. So that is why this report, I think, was important to publish, and that is the context to the report. So what is it about? I describe it as a taxonomy, an anatomy of capture of the Zimbabwean state by its elites. I would describe it as a post-mortem of the cancer that killed the independence dream. I don't believe that there is a great deal in this report that is new. In fact, in its 462 references, you can see that it is largely composed and draws upon media reports, prior research by other organizations, and so on. But what it does, which is new and which I think is its public value, is that it joins the dots so that people, as I say, can see a taxonomy of how a state works to serve its elites rather than to serve its population. Now, you might ask, and it's probably one of the most important questions to ask right at the outset of this webinar is, well, what do illicit financial flows cost Zimbabwe? What does corruption cost Zimbabwe? And one of the answers to that is we don't know, because by their very nature, they are underground and they are hidden. But on page 7 of our report, we itemize instances of corruption, quite a lot of which involves illicit financial flows. And one of the estimates is that corruption is costing the Zimbabwean economy up to 20%, even 25% of its gross domestic product, which in 2020 was 22 billion US dollars. So, but what the report does is that rather than in a sense trying to cost something that is very difficult to cost, to quantify, it tries to show the corporate and political systems that enable the theft of large amounts of money. In fact, to quote the report itself, it says that cartels are formed to transfer wealth from consumers and public funds to the participants in the cartels. And it defines cartels as relationships between the private sector and politicians, relationships within the private sector, and relationships between public enterprise, state-owned enterprise, with the patronage and protection of politicians, but with a private, in inverted commas, interest and investor. And it shows how what effectively these cartels do is that they prop up the political system, they prop up the current elite that is in power and has been in power since 1980 through a mutually beneficial relationship where the private part of it gets extremely wealthy, the public part and the politicians get extremely wealthy, but each scratch the other's back in order to maintain their non-competitive advantage in the economy as a means to make money. So it's about how wealth is recycled continually amongst a tiny elite and kept out of reach of the majority. And again, if you want to understand what's abnormal about the Zimbabwean economy, Tendai may correct me on the exact figure on this, but Zimbabwe has one of the largest informal economies in the world. 90%, I believe, of people who are employed in the informal sector rather than the formal sector of Zimbabwe, which again is evidence of how the real economy is constricted and strangled, killing jobs, killing productive employment and forcing people into informal employment as a means to try to keep alive. And that again explains why you have such very high levels of poverty, such very, very high levels of food insecurity and hunger in the country, because illicit financial flows prevent the development of the economy. They inhibit industrial development, they inhibit economic development. So anybody in Zimbabwe who thinks that this is a developing country that will slowly make progress is fooling themselves, for as long as this stranglehold remains unbroken. And what the report does, which again I think is useful and different, is that it looks at different sectors. It identifies, I think, 5 sectors in the economy which are in the grip of cartels. These sectors are fuel, agriculture, roads, tobacco, and mining. And in each of those sectors, it describes who are the players, who are the political players, who are the economic players. It describes the modus operandi of corruption and illicit financial transactions, whether it is under-invoicing on exports, whether it's illegal smuggling of tobacco, whether it's illegal smuggling of gold, whether it is the selling off of public assets to private buyers, which then resell those very same assets at a much reinflated price in order to make profits, which are then distributed amongst all the people who are part of that cycle. But in each of these areas, it describes that modus operandi. And I must say that although this report caused some unhappiness in Zimbabwe amongst some of the people who have been named and implicated by the report, and I have to say all of them had been implicated before we published this report in media reports, I have not seen any serious attempt to refute it, to discredit it on an evidentiary basis and say, well, you say that the way it works is like this, but in fact it works like that, and here's the evidence. And you know, to give one example, a few people have come forward and said, we're not the directors of this company, but nobody knows who the directors of particular companies are, again, because as Tendai will explain, the law that was going to require declarations of directorships of companies has now been deferred for its implementation for another 2 years. So what you see in Zimbabwe, what I found interesting was that in many ways it's very similar to what we've seen in South Africa. You know, it's different parts of the economy which are exploited. So let me give you 2 examples. The report focuses, as I said, on roads, and it draws attention to ZINARA, the Zimbabwe National Roads Authority, and what happened with a company called Univern and how tenders were used to make massive amounts of money for that company. Very recently, and in fact, I know the Honourable Beattie was about to introduce this report into Parliament before he was removed from Parliament. A report of the Public Accounts Committee has described in very, very great detail how that takes place. And again, you know, how illicit financial transactions take place. You can point to similar instances in relation to, for example, the electricity sector. South Africa's electricity sector was the major target for the people involved in state capture. Zimbabwe's ZESCO, which has also been the subject of an investigation, is not that different. So I guess, Chris, as I'm drawing to a conclusion, one thing you can say is that whilst we may not be able to quantify the exact amounts that involved, it is not. It is actually possible to explain the modus of this type of criminal behavior. So I want to conclude just by finishing on this point, is to say, I guess though, and this should concern Good Governance Africa, the report begs the question, well, what next? It caused a lot of excitement, it caused some consternation, but I'm worried that it hasn't been acted upon. I'm worried, I feel as if this report should be seriously studied. I did send it to the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. They never acknowledged the report. It ought to be a type of report that triggers the type of inquiry we have going on in South Africa at the moment into state capture. But that hasn't happened. The report contains a number of recommendations. Pages 38 to 40 of the report. They're very important recommendations. They wouldn't eliminate illicit financial flows and transactions, but they would make them far more difficult. I think there needs to be discussion of those issues as well. And I think the difficulty that we face is that you can't address the vulnerabilities which are institutional and legislative that allow illegal financial transactions unless you address the politics. But you can't address the politics unless you address the vulnerabilities. So we're in a bit of a chicken and egg vicious cycle. And because we're in that vicious cycle, even since the publication of the report in February of this year, we've seen a further deterioration of the situation in Zimbabwe with the introduction of Constitutional Amendment number 2, with the Patriot Act, which means that some of the discussions we're having even now might be considered illegal before too long. So let me stop there, Chris. I did want to, and I'll make this as my closing point and just say, you know, it's a report about Zimbabwe, but I have to say that as an editor of a publication in South Africa, I think this is a regional problem, and you also have to identify the players in governments, in state-owned enterprises, in criminal networks, in countries like South Africa, because if you were able to cut it off at the neck here, you would also have a major impact in a country like Zimbabwe. So I hope that has given you some idea of the contents of this report. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you so much for sharing some of the high-level insights that emerge from your very important report. And certainly one of the key takeouts for me, which you re-emphasized today, is that, you know, the corruption that we describe as illicit financial flows and tax avoidance, etc., it's not a victimless crime. They are victims. In actual fact, a 2013 African Development Bank report quantified at the time that the cumulative loss in those last 3 years from 2013 from these illicit financial flows were estimated then even as much as $12 billion. So you can actually get a sense that it has a huge impact. It is based on the relationships between networks of corruption that are within the state, that are within the private sector, but more importantly are driven by citizens of these states, most unfortunately. But look, let's bring into this conversation somebody who you have referred to, and that's Honorable Tendai Biti, as former finance minister, and of course, as the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee in the Parliament of Zimbabwe. Does this make any sense to you? Is Mark Haywood and others who are bringing to the forefront some of these serious allegations relating to, let's call it what it is, rampant corruption, almost at the levels of the capture of the state by certain individuals? Does this make sense to you? Can you confirm this, Honorable Biti?
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for organizing this and for the GGA's continued engagement on Zimbabwe. Look, the Daily Maverick report, if I might call it that, and indeed other reports that have been published, with great respect to those who have written those reports, in my respectful opinion, actually scratch the surface. The issue of corruption in Zimbabwe is much, much deeper. The issue of illicit financial flows is much, much more entrenched, particularly after 2017, particularly after the military coup. The military coup ushers in a regime, a group of men and women, in respect of which the hitherto existing tentacles and matrices of corruption in the private sector, in various arms of the state, in particular, the military, they all converge now. They all converge. So there's a conflation of these interests. The Daily Maverick report refers to three dominant players: the private sector colluding with the private sector colluding with the government, and government actors acting on its own. These three forces now conflict from November of 2017. They in fact become the state. There is now no distinction between the cartels in the private sector and the cartels in the state. So that for all intents and purposes, we've become a fully fledged thugocratic state. We've become a fully fledged kleptocratic state, a fully fledged rogue state, particularly after 2017. And so you now have a situation. Before President Mugabe, you had a situation where largely it was power for the sake of power. It was power for the sake of power. And the prime motivation of the reproduction of the state, the prime motivation of authoritarian consolidation, was to retain power. Now you have got a reverse situation where the prime motive of retaining state power is actually to continue accumulation, is to continue extraction. So power is required, but is a means to an end, i.e., the end being extraction, the end being looting, the end being aggrandizement, and the state simply becoming an arena of personal accumulation. Whereas with President Mugabe, it was power for power's sake, and everything else was secondary to power. Now it's corruption, and everything else, including power itself, is secondary to corruption. So I have great detail of the issues that are contained in the report and other reports, and I get this privileged position from my role before I was putted out as chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee, and also my function and my role previously as a Minister of Finance. So before I give some deeper flesh, I want to just say that corruption is a cancer. It puts a huge tax on the state. And I reckon that for every dollar that we receive through taxes in Zimbabwe, 82% of that dollar actually goes to corruption. And so corruption becomes the major cause of Zimbabwe's fragility, of Zimbabwe's vulnerability. But this is not new to Zimbabwe. Look at every other country that is fragile on the African continent. You find this contradiction between huge resources on one hand and huge poverty on the other hand. So you've got an oxymoronic situation of a very poor but rich country. Zimbabwe is an extremely rich country, but it is in fact very poor. 79% of our people, in fact, it's now 83%. 83% of our people are living below the poverty that I'm line, surviving on less than US 35 cents a day. We call it tsawona. Tsawona is literally translated means an accident. The majority of our compatriots are accidents of survival. Look at the collapse of our social indices, maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates. Look at the decay in our infrastructure. If you drive the roads of Harare, you'll be shocked. It's like you are in 1923. Today they were unveiling the statue of Mbuyanianda, who died in 1896. I reckon that you can wake her up today, resurrect her right now. She won't get confused and lost because there's been no development. The only thing that may confuse is that we now addressed fully whereas she used to put on a little thing to cover your genitals. So that's the only development that has taken place. So it's an indictment. So in short, corruption is putting a huge developmental prize on Zimbabwe. The third point I want to make is that corruption is also, because it is the major driver, it has to create certain political outcomes. It has to create the outcome that favors the continued looting and the continued reproduction of this kakistocratic state, for lack of a better word. So the crisis of illegitimacy we face in Zimbabwe, the stolen election of 2018, the stolen election of 2008 that denied Morgan Tsvangirai the right to be president of Zimbabwe, are all now inextricably linked to the huge resources that we have in Zimbabwe. There is a book that has just been published by a man called Tom Burgess, and I know Mark Yewood, you know about this book. It's called Kleptopia, How Dirty Money is Conquering the World. There are about 2 chapters on Zimbabwe, there. Chapter 6, Harare, September 2000, Mr. Billy, and chapter 7, Shutdown. Now, these 2 chapters, what this book does is it basically unpacks illicit financial flows at global level, but it drops in Zimbabwe and Harare, and it exposes how the characters who were major actors in the looting of resources in the 1991 war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, characters like Billy Rottenberg, whom you are mentioned in the Daily Maverick report, become major characters in the coup of 2018, become major characters in the stolen election of 2008 that denied Morgan Tsvangirai the right to be president of Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe's crisis of illegitimacy is inextricably linked to its huge resource base, or more appropriately, to those that are controlling this huge resource base, the cartels and the state actors. So the impact of corruption is more than the pauperization of Zimbabweans, is more than the underdevelopment of Zimbabwe, is also the de-democratization of the state, and for Tarai, the autocratic consolidation in Zimbabwe. Very, very unfortunate outcomes. And I want to give details now of what is corruption, what are the illicit financial flows in Zimbabwe. I want to argue that there are 8 commanding heights of corruption. The Daily Maverick report touches on some of them, but it doesn't exhaust them. So I'll very quickly, in the time that I have, touch on these key tentacles, these commanding heights of corruption in Zimbabwe. The first one is the RBZ, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, and the US dollar. The mismanagement of the foreign exchange regime, the bastardization of the multi-currency regime that I introduced as finance minister in 2009, and the introduction of the Zimbabwean dollar. What is simply happening is that the US dollar has been commodified. So Zimbabwe receives about $5 billion of foreign currency through its imports. That has become a commodity. Anyone who controls that foreign currency, which is the Reserve Bank, and those that are behind the Reserve Bank, means they've got a huge loot of $5 billion. And this has contributed to a massive looting, massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. This has created serious arbitrage, the mismanagement of the US dollar and the mismanagement of the Reserve Bank. As chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee, we produced a report on the central bank, on the RBZ. We essentially come to the conclusion that it is a rogue bank and that it has been responsible for some of the most nefarious forms of illicit financial flows. Second issue, this is touched in the report, is fuel. The fuel sector in Zimbabwe is the Champions League of cartels in Zimbabwe. You will find the Barcelonas there. You will find the Juventus there. You will find the Manchester United there. You will find the Real Madrid there of cartels in Zimbabwe. The biggest fuel cartel is a man called Kudata Gwirei and his company called Secunda, together with a Russian mafia called Trafigura. They control the Zimbabwean pipeline. In other words, every drop of fuel that is imported in Zimbabwe must come through the pipeline from Beira. That is controlled by Kudata Gwirei and Trafigura. From the pipeline, you go to the wholesale companies. The wholesale companies in Zimbabwe, the wholesale sector is essentially controlled by two companies, Kudata Gwirei Secunda and Puma. But Puma is basically the same company, the same Trafigura. Then the retail sector. The retail sector is controlled by the same companies. Number one, BP and Shell, which is now known as Zuva. There you'll find Emmerson Mnangagwa having interest there. There you'll find Glencore having interest there. And I mentioned Glencore because of what it is doing in South Africa, what it is doing on the commodity sector on the African continent. It gets a lot of attention in the book that I've just mentioned, Tom Burgess's Kleptopia. So the retail sector, you find Kudata Gwirei Secunda with the service stations. You find Puma connected to Trafigura. Then you find Zuva. Then you've got small little garages by Total and by Engine. So essentially, and this is the $2 billion industry. This is a $2 billion. Zimbabwe's full imports are around $2 billion a year, and they're essentially controlled by three people: Kudata Gwirei, Trafigura, and then those that are controlling Zuva. So that's a commanding height of corruption. The third pillar commanding height of corruption is command agriculture. The Daily Maverick report touches on it. It's a pity that I was booted out from the Public Accounts Committee before I'd actually written my report on it. It was going to be shocking. In 2017, 2.7 billion US dollars worth of money was stolen through command agriculture directly from Treasury. This is what I mean by the conflation now of under Robert Mugabe. This would never have happened. And I used to be finance minister. The Ministry of Finance is the gatekeeper. But under Emmerson Mnangagwa and this new regime, the gatekeeper has now become the gate crusher. This 2.7 billion US dollars was stolen directly through the Ministry of Finance, directly through Treasury. In 2018, 3.5 billion US dollars was channeled to command agriculture and stolen directly through the Ministry of Finance. As I'm talking to you right now, they can't produce the audited statements for 2019 because I would like to submit that the 2019 report will be shocking and it will show huge amounts of money being channeled through command agriculture. I want to go back again briefly to the US dollar. Because the US dollar is so key, but because those who own the US dollar watch it closely, the Americans, through the Financial Action Task Force, the SWIFT force, they have to dry clean this money. So one of the offshoots of the US dollar is that the cartels are now owning banks such as the ZB Bank, banks such as ZB Bank. They are now owned. In other words, control of the financial sector in other banks like FBC, control of the financial sector in Zimbabwe is inextricably linked to illicit financial flows that include the shenanigans around the US dollar. Number three, the third pillar of illicit financial flows is, of course, commodities. The report writes about gold and diamonds. Right now, you can't mine gold in Zimbabwe without, in one way or the other, paying rent to interests that are linked to the country's president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. We have seen massive smuggling of gold. Only last week, 25 kilograms worth of gold was caught or captured at OR International Airport. Experts estimate that we are losing about US $1.5 billion in illegal gold, exports. That's on gold. On gold, you have seen the acquisition by Kudata Gwire's Landela Mining of 5 mines from the Zimbabwe Mining Development Corporation, including Sabi gold mines. And these were profitable mines, by the way. They've also acquired, Kudata Gwire Secunda is also acquired 2 mines from Muziku Malos Metallion, gold. So gold, Metallion's gold mines. So gold is a major arena of illicit financial flows. They've also liberalized the marketing of gold by allowing CBZ, now controlled by Kudata Gwire, and Fidelity, also controlled by Kudata Gwire, to sell gold. Originally, it was just the Reserve Bank. It was just
so Honorable BT, I think this is actually a good place for us to bring into the conversation, Farai Magu, because of your reference to the mining sector, the resources sector. And in doing so, maybe we can bring up Farai as I engage with you with maybe a couple of last segue questions, which is basically, Farai, in your view, you've heard Honorable BT telling us directly that one of the ways in which these illicit flows are funded is by ensuring that the patronage network has access to mineral resources. In particular, he's talked about gold. There are other resources like diamonds. Maybe you can give us a sense about the extent of this access in the first instance, and then secondly, whether there is a resonance between what Honorable BT has said and these illicit financial flows. And I'll just remind you that you are on mute, and as I'm reminding you that you are on mute and you can come off mute, is to say to those out there watching us, if you have any questions, you can join the debate also by putting up your questions on our comments section, which is available for you, and we'll try and get through as many of the comments and questions as you can. Farai, over to you. Tell us about the resources sector.
Thank you very much, Chris. I am Farai, and I work with Center for Natural Resource Governance, CNRG. I joined the sector in 2008 after a very horrific chapter of our history as a people, when diamonds had been discovered in Marange, in the eastern part of the country. They were discovered in 2006, but the history goes back to 1993, when De Beers applied for an exclusive prospecting order for that region, and they were granted. And when they moved in, according to the law, they were supposed only to do exploration for 3 years, but their exploration license was extended inexplicably for 13 years until 2006, illegally, corruptly. In the meantime, as they were claiming to be prospecting, they were actually mining and shipping the diamonds out of the country. But did the government not know that this looting was taking place? They knew. They were sharing the spoils with De Beers. So the corruption in the extractive sector that we're talking about today dates back maybe even to the time of independence in 1980. It's only that most of the people were not aware that this is happening in our country. We were still celebrating independence, but the government was already in the looting mode. And then in 2008, when the ruling elites felt it was their turn to eat, they deployed the military and the police and the CIO, and there was a massacre of hundreds of people so that they could capture the diamond fields. When they did capture the diamond fields in November 2008, they formed the fly-by-night companies. Two of them were from China. There were actually three: Anjin, Jinan, Sino-Zimbabwe. They also brought in South African company called New Reclam. They brought in some Ghanaians who came and started what they called Jainame. And then there was Marange Resources. All in all, we ended up having about 8 companies that were looting diamonds from Zimbabwe. By 2016, former president estimated that as much as 15 billion US dollars had been looted. Now, we are talking about a country whose GDP, whose annual budget is about 3.5 billion. The point I'm trying to make is that Zimbabwe is not a poor country. Our poverty is a poverty of leadership, where people use their political power not to develop the country, but to enrich themselves. So, how were the diamonds looted? The diamonds were looted directly. People were going inside Marange, taking the diamonds and going all over the world. But there was also another very interesting way in which they were looting the diamonds, and which is still happening to this day. That's a falsification of the value of our diamonds. For instance, diamonds in Marange are 90% industrial quality and 10% gem quality. But when they report to the nation on what we are earning from our diamonds, it's always they are poor quality. They are sold at $40 per carat, which is very further from the truth. Our gem quality diamonds, which is 10% of all mine run in Marange, they constitute, the value, it's about $1,000 per carat. All this is never declared. Yet, the other point is that when you look at Marange, the companies are divided by fence. And yet, when the companies sell their diamonds, the prices differ very significantly. The other company is saying, okay, ours are going for $80 per carat. The other one is saying they are going for $25 per carat. And yet, the geology of the area is the same. Therefore, this is organized crime that is taking place and sanctioned by the state. The other point I want to make is that Honorable BT has already talked about the gold mining sector, but I will just put the mining sector in 3 categories. We have large-scale commercial mines that are coming into the country, mainly from China. Then we have got small-scale mines. These are usually indigenous people also working in partnership with some foreign syndicates. And then we have got artisanal miners who are now flooding the whole country because of unemployment and the economic situation in the country. So when we talk about the large-scale mines, these are negotiated in the office of the president. He is giving special grants to these people whom we don't know. Parliament is left out. They are not consulted. They have no role to play. It is only the president and the Minister of Mines who really know who these people are. So they are not answerable to Parliament. They are not even answerable to the government as a whole. They are answerable to themselves. And then when we talk about the small-scale mines, we are talking about a mix of Chinese small-scale miners together with local miners. who are also getting loans from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. And the loans are never repaid. It's actually a continuous robbing of the taxpayer, because ultimately these loans are going to be repaid by the Zimbabwean people, even though we are not privy to how these people are selected, how they end up accessing money from the treasury. Then we have the artisanal miners. Again, we find the Chinese are joining the artisanal mining sector. And the artisanal miners, what is also developing is that whenever they find large deposits of gold, the ruling ZANU-PF party moves in and they control the sector. They decide who has got access to the mineral. And then this also translates into the smuggling of the gold. We are having a lot of gold that is being smuggled. And what is interesting is that government itself is acknowledging. The president himself said, we have more than 60 million gold that is being smuggled to UAE every year. The finance minister says gold is being smuggled to Cape Town, but nothing is being done. I'll just share a few slides just for us to appreciate the point I'm trying to make, that Zimbabwe is not a poor country. Our poverty is in leadership, in making decisions that benefit the country. Am I able to do this? Share screen. Okay, I'm struggling a bit with this, but anyway, let me proceed. So the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe has become part of the corruption that is in the mining sector, and that it has become the Reserve Bank of the ruling ZANU-PF party. There is too much politicization, militarization, and securitization of minerals in Zimbabwe, whereby somebody who raises the political card and say, I belong to the ruling ZANU-PF, that's the ticket to Zimbabwe's wealth. As a result, the so-called investors that we are attracting are nothing more than criminal networks masquerading as investors. An investor injects money into the economy. An investor creates employment that is sustainable. An investor leaves behind infrastructure that is used by us and future generations. But what we have are fly-by-night investors. One, the workers in the extractive sector are earning a pittance. If you translate the salaries they are getting into the RTG dollar, they are earning less than $100 per month. And that is modern day slavery. If they try to protest, recently we had a Chinese national discharging a firearm when workers were demanding their dues. And when the workers try to, the communities also where the mining is taking place, when they try to organize themselves, I have been trying to organize communities with my team at CNRG for the past 10 or so years. What we have noted is this: whenever people in the local community try to say no to this project, these are the pillars that we have seen on the ground being deployed by the state. Number one, the police at the provincial level. At the highest level, the provincial police officer, the district police hierarchy, the CIO, the military, the provincial resident ministers department, all of them, they come together. You would think there is a foreign army that wants to invade Zimbabwe, but it's only citizens who are not armed with anything, who are simply saying the looting of our resources is not right for the country.
So So Farai, I'm sorry to jump in here, but
Yes.
we are running a bit short of time for this engagement. You raise a startling point here, which is that certainly it does appear that there is this very close nexus between mineral resources, in particular, in these illicit financial flows that we are trying to highlight and talk about. And it raises this question, and probably it's a good point to bring in Professor Francis Gudyanga here to help us unpack this even further and maybe take over from you. For those of you who don't know, Professor Gudyanga, who we'll be bringing up just now, is himself an expert who has focused on the resources sector, but in particular has written this fantastic book known as Minerals in Africa, Opportunities for the Continent's Industrialization. Prof. Gudyanga, if you are there, could you give us a sense about this, whether indeed you are also getting a clear understanding of how this nexus between resources and illicit financial flows occurs, given the research that you're doing? In actual fact, I'm getting a message from our technical team that Professor Gudyanga is not with us. So let's go back then to Farai. Farai, sorry for interrupting you there if you are still with me. You were attempting to give us a sense that in actual fact, it is the citizens themselves and their agitation for a better governed resources sector who inevitably end up getting into trouble with authorities when they agitate for such transparency and accountability. Do you mind continuing with this as we try and bring up?
Thank you, Chris. I want to give you an example. In 2018, we worked with the people in Penalonga. That's where Metal Gold was extracting gold, dumping cyanide in public, and the cattle were dying. People were inhaling cyanide dust. We then organized a protest. We complied with the law. The local people notified the police that we are going to protest on this particular day. Now, what happened is that on the eve of that protest, the people who had signed the letter to the police that we are going to protest were invited to the police in Penalonga. They were then carried to Mutare. They were taken to Mutare Rural District Police. In the room, there were more than 16 police officers, very high-ranking police officers. And then these people were only 2 from the community. During that meeting, one of the senior police officers raised an AK-47 and said to the woman who is a councillor, she was a councillor, she's no longer a councillor. The officer said, "Do you know this thing?" Raising the AK-47. She said, "Yes, I know." "What is it?" "It's a gun." "What is its purpose?" "It is to kill." And she said, "Don't be a statistic. Go back, your children still want you." This is mining in Zimbabwe. Recently, we were working with the community in Dinde, where the Chinese just arrived and they said, "We are going to start drilling, exploring for coal." And when the community tried to resist, one of the members was arrested and spent days in police custody. So what we are seeing here is a government that is wired in resource looting and using the apparatus of the state to suppress the people from resisting domination and the looting of their resources. But the other point, the last point I want to make is that of criminal markets. The resources being looted from Zimbabwe have got criminal markets. These criminal markets are very far and wide, but also very close, including in South Africa. Recently, at OR Tambo, a Zimbabwean was caught with several kilograms of gold. Last year, we had the president of the Zimbabwe Miners Federation, who was arrested at Harare International Airport trying to export gold illegally to Dubai. Some years ago, we had an Israeli pilot who was arrested at Harare International Airport trying to smuggle more than 8,000 pieces of diamonds out of the country. But the other issue that we need to talk about is the judiciary. The judiciary in Zimbabwe is part of the criminal network, in that when these people are arrested, nobody is ever convicted. Not one. Instead, the people they convict are the ordinary Zimbabweans who are caught with 1 carat of diamond or 1 gram of gold. They spend 5 years in jail. But those who are looting billions out of our country, they are scot-free. Thank you.
Let's try and bring back Honorable Tendai Biti, because I have a very pointed question for him if he's still with us. Honorable Biti, and this is really from the floor, and it relates very much to what has come from both Farai and Mark earlier on, which is basically how then do we get the private sector and financial institutions to discuss these issues that have been highlighted today as not just necessary for their long-term sustainability, but also the longevity of the state. And particularly in Zimbabwe, where we have elites led by your successor, people like Minister the finance minister, who basically says or is putting forward this narrative of stabilization, that in actual fact what we're seeing in Zimbabwe is not this grand corruption, but actually the enablement of the private sector to engage in mineral resources. How do we deal with this? And how do we deal with these seemingly at odd narratives that I have just highlighted to you? And of course, this question comes from our colleague Piers Pigu. Honorable Biti.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, so let me just quickly wind down on the main thrust of my address. I touched on the US dollar in the Reserve Bank. I touched on command agriculture. I touched on the fuel sector. And we were just discussing commodities. Farai has mentioned diamonds and gold. The other mineral that is becoming a major source of looting is obviously chrome. And here the Chinese are at play. The fourth mineral that is becoming major center of corruption is of course platinum. And here the Russians have literally taken over every chrome a concession or a deposit outside those that are owned by Zimplats or Impala, and so it's very sad. So from commodities, the number 5 platform of accumulation is procurement contracts. They've been awarding contracts to themselves. If you take the Bide Bridge, Harare Road, it has been awarded to 5 friends or so of the president. There is no respect to the country's procurement laws. There's no respect to the tender board or state procurement board and so forth. So procurement is a real cause of looting in Zimbabwe. The next item of looting are subsidies that are given opaquely. There've been a gold subsidy, tobacco subsidy, agricultural subsidies, which are given subjectively and very corruptly. Another area of corruption is land now. We've had the land reform program, and corruption is taking place in 2 forms. Number 1, it is the unlawful seizure of land by the government itself to aid and abet private players. So if you go to Manika land, Chipinge area, a few years ago, a man called Billy Rottenberg acquired tons and tons and tons of hectares of land to pursue an ethanol project. The same area was affected in Bocha Marange by the diamonds companies who again took huge tracts of land. As I'm talking to you right now, we are involved in a huge battle in Chilonga, Chiredzi, where the government is trying to take thousands and thousands of hectares of land to give to a white man, Kotsia, a friend of the president, who wants to pursue a grass project called Lucene. The same applies to the northeast of the country, northwest of the country, north-south of the country, Wange, Victoria Falls area, in a place called Inde, the Inde community, where the land of the Inde people is being taken to be given to the Chinese, again for corrupt purposes. So apart from this huge rural land, communal land, you also have land barons in urban areas who are also linked to the ruling party. So land has become a major commanding height of corruption. Then, of course, you've got our borders. Our borders are a commanding height of corruption, none bigger than Beitbridge. Every year, more than $8 billion worth of goods flow through Beitbridge. Less than $2 billion of those goods actually pay Zimbabwe's customs duty. So the control of Beitbridge is a major fight in fighting corruption. The Harare International Airport too, but the borders, particularly Beitbridge, particularly Chirundo, are a major site of corruption. Then lastly, you've got parastatals, your grain marketing board, your NOGZIMS, the Zimbabwe United Passenger Company, which is now receiving subsidies of at least $65 million per month. Buses are now being supplied by Landela Mining. Takudata Gray is involved. So these are the 8 major commanding heights of corruption in Zimbabwe. And here you will see the presence of white capital all along. Here you will see the presence of, in all these things that I've spoken about, if you were to put the names of individuals who are controlling the same, your list will not have more than 30 people. So in other words, basically 30 people are controlling and are looting Zimbabweans, black and white. I now come to your specific question, Chris. The private sector in Zimbabwe is not developed. So you don't have capital, you don't have a bourgeois economy in Zimbabwe. You've got ragtag forms of capital whose existence depends solely on the licenses that are given by the state, which is why they are not capable of standing on their own. They are not capable of protecting their own interests. We had a huge fight with the indigenization. They were not capable of fighting that. We've had huge mismanagement of pensions and savings through the mismanagement of foreign currency in Zimbabwe. They are not capable of fighting that. So, and if you take foreign capital in Zimbabwe, companies like Zimplats, companies like the Old Mutual, companies like BAT, companies like Anglo America, they too are very complicit in the looting of Zimbabwe. They too remain quiet and mum about the atrocities and the crisis of misgovernance and leadership prevailing in the country. So the private sector can be looked at as a source and salvation of change and transformation in Zimbabwe. It has to remain the people of Zimbabwe. It has to remain the strengthening of institutions. If we had a strong judiciary, if we had a constitutionalism and the rule of law, and if we had an electoral delivery system accountable to the people that was capable of delivering the genuine desires of the people, would resolve half our problem. Regrettably, we are a long way away from strong institutions, from a decent electoral framework, from citizens that can stand up, particularly in the private sector. So we are in a crisis, and a deep crisis.
Interesting observations there, Honorable BT. Let me bring into the conversation my colleague from Good Governance Africa, Sku Mashingaidze. Really, maybe Sku to give us a sense of how you've been tracking the conversations today and how it lines up with some of the research that you've been doing with regards to these illicit financial flows, but so much more related to the state of affairs in Zimbabwe.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. And greetings to our audience, and greetings as well to our panelists. Thank you so much for the very insightful details of the extent of the illicit financial flows and the cost to the ordinary Zimbabweans. However, before I maybe go on to touch on the key issues raised so far from our panelists, I'll just touch a bit on Prof. Kujiganga's book, Minerals in Africa, since he hasn't been able to be part of our discussion. So in his book, he gives very comprehensive details of the wide array of minerals that are found in Zimbabwe and even in Africa. And his major concern, or the major thesis of his book, is that these minerals have failed to contribute to Africa's industrialization. And for very obvious reasons, I think, as we can pick from the discussions that have obtained so far. And maybe just to extract some of his observations, he says one of the greatest threats to economic and political development of African nations is corruption. And I think we've already heard much about that. Undermining good governance, distorting public policy in very fundamental ways, and leading to misappropriation of resources, and harming the public and private sector development, and importantly, hurting the poor. I think Mark already touched on this, even Honorable BT, as well as Farai Magu, they've already touched on the cost of this to our citizens. So Prof. Kujiganga also goes on to outline, for example, the focus in Zim has largely been maybe on gold and maybe your platinum to a certain extent, but it has largely been on gold. But his book is very useful in terms of bringing to light the wide array of minerals, right, within which looting and illicit financial flows could be taking place. Just to give an outline of some of them, he talks of minerals of precious metals, and there's a whole list under that. He talks of precious stones, minerals of base metals, minerals of radioactive metals, industrial minerals, semi-precious stones, what he also refers to as dimension stones, and he also goes on to touch on energy sources. Of interest, as he outlines, is how the mismanagement of these resources also eventually affect our key sectors. He makes reference to minerals that are so important, for example, to the health sector, and some of the amenities that are required there. So it's not just about following the money, it's essentially about the lives, saving the lives of citizens. So it's a very comprehensive and rich book, which is worth getting hold of. Okay, so to move on to some of the key points that have been raised in this discussion, I think an important point here is the real cost of corruption on the ordinary Zimbabwean citizen. Mike Haywood particularly pointed out that illicit financial flows are not a victimless crime. And so therefore every Zimbabwean should be interested. It is the citizens, particularly those living in poverty, who bear the brunt. And Farai Magu, who brought to light how some citizens have paid with their lives, or some are living in fear, or living under the constant threats, of fear of the state, because they have made an attempt to follow the money or to demand transparency and accountability. And then I think an important point as well that was raised is the definition of illicit financial flows as state-sanctioned organized crime. And I think we had enough of just how much this is state-enabled. And then another key point is how power, Honorable BT drew a comparison, for example, to the pre-2017 era, where power was really, the pursuit for power was for power's sake. But now, post-2017, power has become a means to ensure that patronage networks continue to enjoy access to resources, and hence enabling the illicit financial flows. A grave concern given how rich Zimbabwe is as a country in terms of its mineral wealth, in terms of its land. Prof. Kujiganga's book details, as I've already indicated, the extent of the mineral wealth that can be found in this country. And then concern was also raised about too much politicization, militarization of the minerals sector, where you find that investors in Zimbabwe are nothing more than criminals. I think this is Farai Magu who raised that they're just fly-by-night investors who are not contributing to the development of the country, even in terms of its infrastructure. And you'll find that there are human rights violations, particularly even within Chinese companies. And, you know, the perpetrators have not been brought to book, right? There's a sense of helplessness even amongst citizens when it comes to the power that Chinese companies or their owners exude within the country. There are places, for example, you go to and there are no-go areas for local communities because there's a Chinese company mining there, and who knows what else is going on. That is why at the end of the day, you have these opaque deals being enabled and companies or investors claiming to be prospecting, but in reality already looting the country. And then I think another key point that was raised was, for example, one of the questions that would come up is, would a Zondo commission kind of inquiry be useful in terms of investigating illicit financial flows in Zimbabwe? But what are the prospects of that given the state of the judiciary as it stands right now? I think one of our speakers also touched on how that route may not necessarily lead us to the solutions that we are looking for. And then Mark Haywood also noted that it is very difficult to tackle any type of corruption where, for example, demanding accountability or transparency, in doing that, one has to pay with their life, right? And then one of the important observations made by the ARC report is how Zimbabwe is becoming central or almost serving as a conduit for illicit financial flows that are enabling conflict in the region. Of course, they are quick to note that this hasn't been fully developed, but it's a concern. And I think there was touch, obviously, on how in Cabo Delgado, for example, the province has been plunged into conflict because of this mismanagement of resources. Okay. And then one of the key observations as well is how the economy has been constrained by cartels, forcing the citizens into the informal sector. I think the informality of the Zimbabwean sector is there for all to see. I mean, you look all around you, because there is no investment in our industries. If you go around the country right now, most of what used to be industries are really just shells that have become venues for church gatherings. Why? Because the industries are non-existent. There is no real tangible investment in the country. So illicit financial flows have served to inhibit the development, the industrial development of the country. Okay, and then I would like to move on to pick some key points. And may I highlight that I think our panelists gave so much of very important observations, but and it's I can only pick a few because of time, right? Honorable Biti noted that corruption or illicit financial flows have served as a driver of fragility and collapse of the country. I don't need to go into specific details of that, but he has also touched on how the illegitimacy crisis is linked to the depth of corruption and even to the failure of the democratization agenda in Zimbabwe, and how Zimbabwe and Harare are really at the center as well of the global corruption crisis. And then the 8 commanding heights of corruption, at whose helm is the RBZ, and the exploitation or manipulation of the US dollar. And then gold as a major arena of illicit financial flows. Right.
So it's cool. I think we'll bring you back up to help us summarize some of the key findings that you're sharing with us right now. But you raise a couple of interesting questions I want to direct straight to one of our interlocutors, and that's really Mark Hayward. And Mark, to you, a question has also come up from the floor, which basically says, if we bring this all together, what Tendai has shared with us, Tendai, BT, what has been shared with us by Farai, and what you have highlighted from the Cartel's report, is there a possibility of reversing this decline that we've seen in state capacity and governance? And I think more importantly, as Honorable BT highlights, this question of legitimacy, the legitimacy of the state, can it ever be restored without, first of all, addressing this issue of illicit financial flows, corruption, and the plunder, the looting that we've seen? Mark?
Thank you, Chris. Look, we have no choice but to reverse it as citizens of the region. We have seen in South Africa, we are seeing it's not complete by any means, and it's not guaranteed that we will be successful at the end of the day. But we've seen how the combination of effective civil society, protest, media exposure, puts state capture to some degree on the back foot, and has allowed us to reclaim some of our democratic space and some of our institutions of government. So I would say, yes, we have to reclaim it. But the question, as Mbalani says, is how do we do this? And I would say there are three things. The first thing is that we need more media exposure. We need to constantly put what has been the subject of today's discussion into the spotlight, so that the ordinary citizens of our countries, be they in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, or in South Africa, do not think that poverty and inequality is the natural order of things, but see how that this poverty and inequality is being made for us by the elites, and that we have to stand up against it. You know, Mbalani, for example, talks about her research across SADC, and I mentioned how there's a common modus operandi and how these elites overlap. Well, we need to describe that. You know, if needs be, we need another report that shows what you are uncovering, and then we need to find ways to make sure that these reports are not just consumed by elites like us on this webinar, but are understood by the ordinary people of our country. The second thing that I would say is that we haven't talked about it today, and I'd be interested to hear what Honorable BT and others think about this, but I don't think we must give up pressure on the Southern African development community. We allowed the SADC tribunal to be dismantled at Zimbabwe's instigation with the complicity of South Africa, but we must fight for a meaningful regional body that stops this. Because again, if these illicit financial flows are regional, they can only be stopped through regional collaboration. That needs more regional civil society collaboration. I'm very glad from South Africa to be speaking with my comrades in Zimbabwe and other countries on this webinar today, but we need to do this on a more regular basis. And so we have been discussing in this webinar, for example, the role of the private sector. Well, in South Africa, the companies that Farai and Tendai mentioned as being complicit in illicit financial flows, many of them are located in South Africa. We must call them out as South African companies and put them under pressure to ask them, what are you doing? Or when will you stop your participation in this? At least here, we have the democratic space still to be able to do that, to protest, to petition, etc. So that we have no choice. And I'll finish, Chris, on this point in relation to this question. You know, a few days ago, I had lunch with the daughter of one of the very most well-known leaders of Frelimo from the early days. And in discussion with her, it became clear to me just how desperate the corruption is in Mozambique. but I recognized the similarities with Zimbabwe, but I also recognized that if a halt isn't put to this, the fate of hundreds of millions of people across Southern Africa is one of perpetual poverty and deepening desperation rather than an improving environment. So with organizations like yours, with the people like we've had today, with the people who are on this tuning in for this discussion, and the resources and knowledge that they have, we have to pool our resources and we have to fight back.
Good points there, Mark. And you certainly have key collaborators in Good Governance Africa. Honorable BT, let me bring you in here. It's been raised here by Mark Haywood that there are questions around the capabilities, in particular, of regional organizations like the Southern African Development Community to intervene, to support basically initiatives at restoring governance, transparency, accountability, but more importantly, some level of legitimacy that you say there's a dearth of in the state in Zimbabwe. Are you confident at all in the region? Are you on mute?
Yes, I'm just unmuting myself. Yes, Chris, I think that I've absolutely no confidence in the regional structures. SADC, I think we've discussed these issues, Chris, in another forum. I think that the African Union can be spared as well. But I think let me address specifically on illicit financial flows and say that it's beyond the region, it's beyond SADC, it's beyond the African Union. And I want to make reference to the high-level panel appointed or led by President Thabo Mbeki a few years ago, the UN high-level panel on illicit financial flows from Africa. And I think one of the key issues that we must all push is that we need an international convention on illicit financial flows. Without that, poor small countries like Zimbabwe, like Malawi, like Lesotho, even South Africa, you are very vulnerable because big guys are at play here. The Russians are at play, the Chinese are at play, rogue characters in the West are at play. So you need an international treaty, you need international sanctions. Look at how effective the FATF is, the Financial Action Task Force of the United States, has been formed in as recent as 1998, but it has scored huge success in dealing with money laundering, international terrorism, but only as it relates to international financial system under SWIFT. So can you imagine if we had a similar global agency dealing with all kinds of illicit financial flows? As I'm talking to you right now, one of the things that we Africans are having to grapple with is huge billions of dollars that are stolen from Africa, and they are never banked in Africa. They are banked in Swiss bank accounts. They are banked in huge accounts in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Shanghai. The Nigerians will tell you of billions and billions that were stolen by Sonia Abacha and other presidents that are in Swiss banks. The Congolese from Zaireans will tell you about billions and billions of dollars stolen by Mobutu Sese Seko that are again in Swiss accounts. Somalians will tell you about billions stolen by Siad Barre. Cote d'Ivoirians will tell you about billions stolen by Hofedi Bwinyi. So we need international law and international protocol that makes the recipient countries of our corruption accountable to their own laws and to international law. So the point I'm making is that it will require more than domestic regional bodies like SADC. But that is not to say that we don't require. I think we need regional instruments. The dismantling by ZANU-PF of the SADC tribunal with the complicity of President Zuma, I think was a disaster, was a complete disaster. Secondly, the African Union tribunals need to be strengthened so that they don't have, that they are not courts of last resort, which is the case at the present moment. You have to exhaust the domestic remedies. That's not good enough. So we need a forum, we need a legal forum which actualizes the SADC values and principles, the African Union values and principles, and all these international charters, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, CEDAW and others, then conventions on corruption, conventions against torture, child racketing, and so forth. In other words, we need international law to provide the deterrence that is missing right now. Why should President Biya be free? I saw him walking, being greeted by the Prime Minister of Britain the other day, and he has stolen billions from Gabon. Gabon is a small, tiny country with 2 million people. I don't think you know, Chris, that it is the champagne capital of the world. It's not France. It's Odimba's Gabon, because they've got so much money and they've got a small population. Central African Republic, one of the richest countries in the world. But to call it a country is a joke. I've spoken about Zaire, DRC, one of the richest countries in the world, but it's neither democratic nor is it Republican. Zimbabwe, take Angola, the billions of dollars that were stolen by the Dos Santos family. I used to like a mail that Dos Santos was so, I was going to say pretty, but that's dangerous. I won't say it. But they stole billions, Chris. They stole billions and billions of dollars. And that money is in Portugal. That money is in Swiss. President Dos Santos right now is staying on a mansion in Barcelona, not so far away from where Lionel Messi is staying. He probably has got huge billions of money. Here in Zimbabwe, we are looking after Mengistu Haile Mariam. It's a disaster. Finally, I want to make this point, Chris, that if the most accentuated corruption in our region is in Zimbabwe, is in Mozambique, is in South Africa, and is in Angola. Now, there's a common thread. That common thread is liberation movements. That common thread is the ANC. That common thread is ZANU-PF. That common thread is Frelimo. That common thread is the MPLA. What is it about these movements and state capture? What is it about these movements when they are tired and exhausted about looting and looting and looting? We need to revisit these movements and their ideology and their philosophy, because you can see a common thread. I'll stop here.
I can see you could go on telling us more about champagne capitals, Honorable Biti. but one of the things that I'd like to do is bring Farai. Maybe you can keep all three of us up on the screen, Tendai and myself and Farai. Farai, you've heard Honorable Biti and what he said. He has no confidence in the ability of regional mechanisms, in particular within our Southern African region, to do it. Do you agree with this, especially within your field of expertise, which is governance of natural resources? Are you on the same boat?
Yes, I agree with Honorable BT. I think African Union is a trade union of African leaders. It is not a union of the African people. The African people are on their own. Therefore, the ideal situation that I would like to see with our natural resource endowment in the continent, one, there is need for integration of our economies. Secondly, there is need for value addition of African mineral resources on the African continent. But what we have is that because our leaders live for today, they don't invest for tomorrow. As soon as a mineral is brought out of the ground, they want to take it to China so that they can pocket a few millions of dollars. But this integration, I believe it's very critical. And the other thing, minerals are finite. Very soon, I mean, even in Zimbabwe, we have some towns which are dying because the resource has now been exhausted. We want to see linkages between mining and other sectors of the economy, such as agriculture. I've talked earlier on about the fly-by-night investors who do not bring a single penny. They just bring their caterpillars and they take and they go. But we want to see linkages between mining and the financial sector, between mining and agriculture, between mining and infrastructure development. But how do we get there? The top-down approach is not going to work because African Union and SADC are trade unions of presidents. I believe in the bottom-up approach where people on the ground, they organize, they unite, they disrupt the pillaging that is happening on the continent. We were decolonized because at some point we had Africans who said we have had enough of colonialism. They started organizing liberation struggles. Umkondo Wesizwe, Zanla forces, they said, let's liberate our continent. And it worked for them. Unfortunately, the freedom that they fought for remains a pipe dream for all of us. But I like this bottom-up approach where people take matters into their hands. Thank you.
Thanks, Farai. And in actual fact, I think it's a good segue here also to bring in my colleague, Sku, to come and give us basically a summary of the deliberations as they have gone on. But before Sku comes in, maybe one of the things to point out here is that this nexus between patronage networks, some of our liberation movements, is important to point out, in particular the fact that we've done some work about this particular phenomenon in Africa, in fact, where we discuss the role of liberation movements with regards to governance. But without further ado, Sku, over to you, maybe to give us a brief summary of how you've been tracking the debate so far.
Sure, Chris, and given our time, I think I'll just raise a few key issues from the discussion, maybe in the direction of solutions or addressing the issue of illicit financial flows. Mark Haywood, I think, emphasized on the need for further investigations, that the report must continue to seriously be analyzed and used to continue advocating and engaging in a bid to address the issue of illicit financial flows. And another point that there is need to continue putting pressure on SADC, notwithstanding its shortcomings. And I think another very crucial observation from Honorable BT there about the need for an international convention, because this is not a Zimbabwean problem, it's not a regional problem, and therefore there is need for a global strategy to curb illicit financial flows. And Farai echoed the need for integration of our economies and the need for value addition of our mineral resources. Professor Gujikanga's book also touches in a very detailed manner on how Africa or African nations have been shortchanged by the export of their raw materials. And maybe as a last point, because of time, one of the key observations that the Cartel's report makes is how some of the countries, for example, the sanctions regime in a way enabled the growth of illicit financial flows, because then African countries like Zimbabwe had to look east. And in looking in that direction, it was then turning to countries that are financially secretive by nature, and they have weak anti-money laundering legislation, and this has therefore enabled illicit financial flows. I think I will stop there to enable further discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Sku, for that input. And certainly I think I can concur with you as you point out that the Cartel's report that is being referenced here by Mark Hayward in particular really raises this question about the deep implications to public interest that these illicit financial flows, but really the rampant corruption linked to the financial flows have with regards to also environmental breaches in terms of the manner in which the extractive industry in particular, who have links to some of these financial flows, operate and engage. What has actually occurred with great interest today is that some of these players in Zimbabwe have been highlighted not just as having links to the patronage systems, but really as individuals who not only undermine the systems of governance in Zimbabwe by their actions, but seemingly engage in steps to override the crucial role of parliamentary oversight, the crucial role of the judiciary and other key institutions in Zimbabwe, which have these regulatory and crucial sort of responsibilities. So as we wrap up now, I'm going to invite our guests in 2 minutes each to basically give us very quickly their closing remarks. And we'll start off with Mark Hayward.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who's attended. Look, I just think that I'd like to acknowledge the people who wrote the Cartel's report in Zimbabwe and the importance of this type of analysis and expose for arming Democrats and good citizens and honest people to push back and try to build societies where the riches of our countries, and they're numerous, as Farai and Honorable Beatty said, are distributed equally amongst our people. You know, this particular report, we published it. We received a number of threats as a result of publishing it. We are being sued by one of the people who was implicated in the report. I won't mention at the moment who. I'm not worried because I believe in the veracity of the report, and I think that anybody who wants to take it on in a court of law may find that it becomes a much wider spotlight on the conduct of certain industries and sectors that are being implicated and have been named in the course of this afternoon's webinar. So we just have to push on. There's too much at stake. There's too many people suffering in Southern Africa. And as my fellow panelists have said, although much of our focus has been on the misconduct of the elites of our region, it's very much connected with power in the developed countries. I very, very much agree with Honorable Beatty that there is a need for an international convention to stop illicit financial flows and to nip it perhaps at its heart, which is in the countries, the most developed countries of the world, where there is the greatest power to put a stop to this this type of thing. So thank you for the opportunity to be part of this interesting and important discussion this afternoon.
Thanks, Mark, for your inputs and valuable insights. Let's hand over to Honorable Beatty. 2 minutes, Honorable Beatty, to give your closing remarks to the discussions that we've had today.
Well, I want to urge more exposure of the corruption in Zimbabwe. So work by Mark, the hidden authors. They can also talk to people like myself, because I've got so much information. The parliamentary reports we have produced, Mark was talking about the Zenara report. It's a tour de force. It's like a dissertation. So that's on procedural issues. Let's have more exposure. But I think for Zimbabwe, we face the biggest existential crisis as a country. because we are now run by bandits, we are now run by thugs. The conflation that I've spoken about, and corruption has become a much bigger issue than ever before in our country. So as we move forward, trying to democratize our country, in the past we were worried about violence, we were worried about lack of reforms around electoral laws, media reforms, and so forth. Our biggest challenge now represents state capture, anchored by corruption and the conflation with the military and the securocratic state. So Zimbabwe is now an extremely different country right now, an extremely dangerous country, which means as Democrats, we're going to require more help to try and gate the change that we deserve. It's a tough task and it's a tough call.
Thank you so much, Honorable BT, for your final remarks. And over to you, Farai Magu, for your closing remarks, sir.
Thank you very much, Chris. First, I want to thank you again for convening this. I think this is the greatest call of our generation. It is to fight organized crime and the plunder of our resources. In that struggle, everybody has got a role to play. The media has got a role to play. Civil society has a role to play. The business sector has got a role to play. Parliament and government ministers. It's a time for ethical leadership to emerge on the continent. People who don't use power and say it's our turn to eat, but people who think of those children in the remote areas, people who think of the next generations of Africans, that what shall we leave behind for them? So it is a struggle. We are fighting against very dangerous people, but we have to do it anyway. And we need to know, we need to investigate, we need to have knowledge and expose corruption so that other sectors like us in civil society, we have something to work with. I will not overemphasize the importance of the Cartel's report, how much debate it generated in Zimbabwe until now. So the more we investigate, we research, the more we get tools to fight with this struggle for economic justice. Thank you very much.
Over to you, Siku, for your final remarks in 2 minutes, please. Sorry, Siku, you are on mute.
Sorry about that. Okay, I was saying what we have seen today, I think elite bargains whose cost is at a community level. And therefore, I'd like to draw everyone to a campaign that we had in the beginning of the year as Good Governance Africa, the resource case campaign, where we touch on some of these issues and where we bring out how some of these elite bargains, for example, eventually lead to a situation where investors are obviously going into community land, ancestral land, community resources, and impacting their livelihoods and their health. So my last words really are to say there is need for a concerted effort at both local, at a local level, as well as at a national level, and external pressure. There's need for a concerted effort in that in order to curb illicit financial flows. Thank you.
And really all that's left for me to do at this stage is to thank all of our participants for joining us today, and certainly also our panelists for the great insights that they've shared with us with regards to illicit financial flows. I think what's clear is that in solving Zimbabwe's escalating governance challenges and indeed crisis, one of the things that we need to focus on is how do we address this question around illicit financial flows as a way to stop the predatory nature of some of the political elites that have been highlighted in the discussions that we've had today. certainly one of the key things that we need to do is ensure that by curbing these initial financial flows, that we address this problem in a more holistic and sustainable way in order to ensure that good governance does ultimately prevail in Zimbabwe. It's been great having this conversation with you. I wish you a pleasant rest of your Africa Day, and we hope to see you again in our next upcoming webinars that we'll be holding as Good Governance Africa in conjunction with our partners, Mail and Guardian. Have a good afternoon. Take care.